Hello, can everyone hear me? All right, thank you. I got a thumbs up. That's a good start. I'm going to kick off. I'm going to be speaking to you for the next half an hour about life after appraisals. So for those of you who are a bit worried that I'm going to give you loads of stats and figures about why appraisals don't work, I'm not. I think we all know pretty much nowadays that appraisals aren't working. So what I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about is how to fix them, based on my experience of working as a HR director, as a performance management consultant, and more recently as founder and CEO of Clear Review. Now, I'd like to start with, I think, one of the core problems of performance management. It's actually these two words here. The problem is they fill most HR people with dread. We see these words, and this is the last thing we want to get stuck into fixing. But it doesn't have to be like that. What about if we reframed it and said, performance management, what we're really talking about nowadays is this, or put another way, this. Now, if we think of performance management in these terms, it shouldn't be something that we dread. It should be something that we aspire towards. So with that in mind, I'd like you to think of this phrase here and imagine that I had set you a project as an HR professional and said, I'd like you to develop a tool or a process that could improve and develop people's performance on an ongoing basis. So just think about that for a few seconds. Think about what that tool or process might look like that could develop people and help achieve their full potential. So how many of you would have come up with this as the solution? None of us, right? But yet this is the tool that the majority of organizations today are still using to try and improve the performance of their employees. So we're using the wrong tool for the job nowadays. I'd like to tell you a story to illustrate the point I'm just making here. So this is me 25 years ago. I was at university studying human resources management and music. It's a highly recommended combination of subjects. I believe I'm the only person in the country with that particular degree. Now, when I was at university, every Friday I had my weekly tutorial, and I would be told in specific detail what I was doing well and what I could improve and do better. So every single week I was getting that kind of developmental feedback. When I left university, I got a job on the HR program of an FMCG, large global organization. Imagine my surprise when I was told that I get that feedback only twice a year. Now, we often think about performance and feedback being something that millennials ask for. Well, I'm not a millennial, but I wanted that same level of feedback. So there was a real disconnect when I moved into that workplace and saw that it was just very once or twice a year. Imagine my surprise as well when I was told that before I could get that feedback on how I was doing, I'd have to fill out a 12-page one of these. And at the end of doing that, all my performance and all the hard work and achievements and progress I've made over the last 12 months would be summed up in 2 words, a rating. Now, that was a bit of a shock for me as a student coming from university. And I was pretty competitive, so I spoke to my manager. I said, right, I see there's 5 ratings here. I want to go for that top one, which was called Outstanding Performance. And my manager said, oh, no, you can't get that one. And I said, what do you mean I can't get that? Well, nobody gets that one, so there's no point in even going for it. So I think there's some nods and laughs going on about how ridiculous the kind of situation where we've ended up in performance management. I didn't hang around there for more than a couple of years. I left and I worked for a very different kind of company. I worked for Sony Music, which was a record company, and spent many years there, eventually becoming their international HR director. And why that was interesting is because they didn't have appraisals. They didn't have competency frameworks, yet we still developed people, we still did performance-related pay, we actively managed talent pipelines, we did succession planning, but we did all of it without ever introducing an annual appraisal. And what we had there, which was very noticeable, was a culture of what I would call radical candor, so really honest feedback. People always told you what they thought because there was no meeting to save it up to. Now, I can't promise you that feedback was always beautifully worded. There was a lot of 4-letter feedback flying around. It was a record company. You might expect that. But you really always did know where you stood in terms of your job. I left there and spent many years running a performance and talent management consultancy. And we worked with many organizations trying to make performance management better. And whatever thing that you can tinker with or change in performance management, you can guarantee that we did it. So we did competency frameworks, values, behaviors, changed rating scales, took away rating scales. We did all those things, and it became apparent over that time that while we were actually streamlining processes, putting things online, taking away some of the pain, when we actually sat down after many years and said, are we actually improving people's performance? The sad answer we said to ourselves is that we weren't. So I asked my consulting team the same question as I asked of you earlier on. What would a tool or process actually look like that would improve people's performance on an ongoing basis? And we came up with a number of things. Firstly, we said, we've got to get rid of these 12-month objectives because they don't seem to mean anything. It's almost like you stop your work, do what HR asks you to do, fill out the objectives, put that aside in a drawer, and then get back to work. It's not meaningfully part of people's day-to-day work. Why do we ask for these objectives? Because we feel as an HR profession, well, we need people to, if we're going to evaluate, we need something to base that on. That's why they existed. So what we said is they need to be more meaningful. They need to be part of people's work. So we call them near term. So shorter term goals are actually relevant to what people are doing on a day-to-day basis. That was number one. Number two, we recognized from our own experience and from all the research out there is that for feedback to be effective, it needs to be given as soon as possible after the event. It can't be saved up for several months later. It doesn't have any impact. Or worse still, what we noticed is that the manager gets to the meeting and he's got his bit of feedback written down that he wants to discuss. And it's a bit awkward because it happened a couple of months ago. So guess what? I just won't bother. So we don't want that. So feedback needs to be given as soon as possible after an event happens. Thirdly, we can't improve performance based on a once or twice a year discussion. Would you hire a coach and only see them once or twice a year and expect to improve? You wouldn't. And it's the same with performance management. If we wanted to improve performance, the conversations need to be more regular. But tied into that, we can't expect people to engage in regular conversations if they're spending hours filling out forms and documentation. It's a hard sell to managers to say, meet with your people monthly and talk meaningfully and have developmental chats. Oh, by the way, at the 3 hours at the end of the year, you're going to have to fill out all this paperwork and documentation and do it all over again. So we have to minimize the form filling and maximize the conversations. Now, we felt if we could do all of these four things, then when it came to the bit that's actually quite difficult, how do we meaningfully differentiate performance and measure performance? Well, if managers are doing all of this stuff, they're more likely to be objective when we ask them to differentiate performance. So that's the theory. Now, if that's the theory and it all seems quite sensible, why is it that so many organizations still haven't moved to that model and are still doing the classic annual appraisals? And there's two reasons, in my view: fear and confusion. Fear, we've been doing appraisals for so long. They've been in place for over 50 years. It's what we know. It's what I was taught when my HR degree. It's what we feel comfortable with. And I don't know if anyone else has felt this, but when I worked in-house, everyone had a blooming opinion on performance management, from the board all the way down to employees. So the idea of changing it is pretty scary, and I get that. There's also a huge amount of confusion. So we hear these words like continuous performance management, continuous conversations, real-time feedback, and it makes sense in theory, but how does it actually work in practice? What does that look like on a day-to-day basis? And how am I actually going to get people to do this? So we end up with all these questions that come up. Now, there are answers to all these questions, I can assure you. So I understand why people are confused, but I'm going to try and give you some answers to some of those questions in the next 15 minutes or so. The question about how do I manage pay is a massive one that comes up a lot from the people we talk to. I'm not going to have time to get into that today, but I have written an ebook on this subject. So if you come and see us afterwards, our stand is just behind this wall. We can take your details and we can send you that ebook. So to start answering these questions, what we need to do is understand what the model looks like on a day-to-day basis for this new way of managing performance. And this is the model that we work to. It's based around what we call the check-in. Again, if you want copies of these slides, come and see us. We can send them to you as well. It's based around what we call the check-in, which is a more meaningful conversation that happens more frequently than you would say an annual appraisal. Typically, our customers do this between every 1 and every 3 months, depending on the culture. And in the check-in, we're talking about 3 distinct things. We're talking about people's progress against their goals, but these agile goals, these shorter-term goals that can be added and changed at any time, not these 12-month ones that you get to the end of the year and they're not relevant anymore. We're talking about development, and to make that meaningful, rather than having a PDP that's filled out and put in the drawer and brought out the next year and, oh, I didn't do all of that, we turn those into goals as well, meaningful developmental goals that people can actually action within a reasonable time frame. Feedback is given in real time using tech as an enabler, and this continues all of the time. And this is the process that improves people's performance. Fine. But then when it comes to the measurement and evaluation, which we know many organizations do need to do to identify talent or to do performance-related pay, we can still do that, but we need to make sure it is a separate process. Now, in our system, it's all within the same system, but it's done separately. And that came out in a really important report that the CIPD published a couple of years back, saying that if we're going to have developmental things to performance management and we're going to have evaluation, the two must not sit together. And it makes sense because I'm not going to be honest with you about my concerns, my vulnerabilities, where I need to develop, if I think it's going to affect a rating that's going to affect my performance and promotion opportunities. So that's the model. Who actually uses this model? Just going to flip forward here. So since we launched 3 years ago, over 200 organizations in the UK and overseas as well have used this model using our software. And I think the takeaway from this slide is that you can see it's from a very wide range of sectors. And I think the point to take away from that is that if you have a process that's simple and that's flexible, supported by good technology like ours, it can work in pretty much any organization, from the public sector through to banks, through to film studios and football clubs, very diverse range of organizations. So I'd like to hit a question head on that we get quite a lot. Say, Stuart, I get you. It's all about meaningful conversations. So why do I need technology? Well, the short answer is, if you're asking people to do things more regularly, as we are here, and you don't have technology to underpin that approach, it's really hard to get traction. Getting rid of appraisals is the easy part. I spoke to someone who headed up a London borough. He said, well, I just sent an email, said we're not doing it anymore. That's the easy bit. Getting people to actually engage in meaningful conversations is harder, and you need technology to do that. And we've had many organizations that have tried to make that switch without technology, and they've failed to get traction. And it's interesting, I had a conversation with someone from the CIPD about a year ago, and they said, you know, I know many people that have tried to do this, Stuart, and asked me the same question, why do I need the technology? And we had a discussion, and he said that some of the organizations they were working with, they found out later that some employees hadn't had a conversation in over a year. And I said to him, well, how have they let that happen? And he said, well, the HR people just didn't know. So it brings me to the first reason why you need technology is visibility. If you don't know whether people are having conversations, you can't do anything about it. As an illustration of this, I'd like to share with one of our first case studies with you, which was the Valuation Office Agency. And they're part of the civil service, and they were given leave to be one of the first parts of this public sector to get rid of appraisals and move towards the model that I introduced to you earlier on. They knew they needed, as it was part of, there was a lot of eyes on that pilot, they knew they needed to have visibility of whether people were doing this or not. Unfortunately, they didn't have our tech when they launched it. And they would managers were having to complete spreadsheets of when they carried out these conversations, because that's the only way that they could see that they could keep tracks on that. And unfortunately, the process of doing that was detracting from all the good stuff and all the good communications around the human side of communication. So when we showed them our tech, I remember the person I showed it to was kind of speechless, because they said, for the first time, without doing anything, I can just see who's having conversations. Are people getting feedback? I don't need to use spreadsheets to track this stuff. The software is tracking that for me, and I've got visibility, and I can dive into all the reports that I need to, and then have conversations with managers where the actions are not happening. A second public sector organization we work with, this is the first council to get rid of appraisals and move towards this approach. What they do is they publish leaderboards for their leaders of which bits of the business are doing this and which bits aren't, and the CEO personally sees that. So part of this is getting accountability, and every culture is different, but in their organization, they found that just knowing that the CEO had eyes on which bits of the business were engaging in this stuff, no one wanted to be the head of the business where their managers weren't having conversations. So that's just one example. The other thing that they do as well is that they go and see the managers who are not engaging in conversations and start to have an honest discussion about why it's not happening. And what you find is that there's a lot of different factors involved in this. Some managers actually maybe don't even want to be a manager, but it was the only way to get promoted to a certain level. We call those accidental managers. So once you start to know who isn't and isn't doing it, you can start having the conversations that get to the root cause, and that's how you start to change behaviors. The second reason why you need technology is to provide what I call a framework. One of the mistakes I've seen organizations doing is everyone hated the formal annual appraisal and all the bureaucracy, so you throw it all out. but then there's no framework left. And managers and employees need some kind of framework in which to operate. And by framework, I mean, what do I need to do? How often do I need to do it? Technology is really good at this, because say you introduce this new framework and you did a presentation internally to all your staff and said, right, this is the new performance management approach. Off you go. I expect you to be doing this. A month later, when the memory of the presentation has faded away, are the managers going to remember what they need to do? So let's contrast that experience for a manager using tech. Again, so this is what a manager sees in Clear Review, for example. They can see at a glance whether they're doing the right things, and it tells them what they need to be doing. That everyone in their team should be getting feedback about once a month. Everyone should be having a check-in conversation every 12 weeks. Most managers, when you say those things, they say, well, I think that sounds reasonable, but it's hard for them to keep track on it. So this is keeping track on it for them, giving them that framework and nudging them where they need to take action. Now, technology is often thought about as something that is just there to capture data. Now, I've always had a belief that technology can be much more than that. It can be powerful to actually change behaviors. And if we want people to move towards meaningful conversations, we're talking about a behavior change here. So to explain how tech can actually facilitate this, I'd like to introduce you to a bit of psychology. So there's a guy at Stanford University. He's the director of behavioral science, and he's called Dr. B.J. Fogg. And he's come up with a model that helps to explain how we can change behavior, specifically relating to using tech. And he said a behavior will occur if three things are present: that the individual, if they have the sufficient motivation, if they have the ability to carry out the action at that time, and if there is a trigger. And if all those things are present at the same time, then a behavior should occur. Now, I think triggers are probably the easiest to understand, so I'll start there. What tech is really good at is monitoring activity. So our tech can sit in the background and monitor who's doing what, and it can send people triggers, whether it's an email or on-screen nudge, when they need to take action. Now, we need to provide those external triggers until things become a habit. Once things are habit, so we don't need to check our phones to check social media because we've just gone into the habit. But at first, we needed those email triggers, and it's really important that we get those. Now, the great thing about tech, you're not sending out bulk emails. It's monitoring all the time and just sending out little nudges where it needs to. Ability, what Doctor refers to, needs a little bit more explanation because he's not referring to the skills to carry out conversations. Of course, that needs to happen, and people need to be trained on that. But what he's referring to here is three things. It's the ability to carry out an action at a given time is defined by how long it takes, how many brain cycles it uses, so what's the mental effort required for me to do it, and how much it disrupts my original routine. Now, the better a thing is in those particular three items, the more likely I'm going to be able to do that. Now, that's a bit theoretical, so I'm going to illustrate that with a real-life example. So if we think about what's involved in having a check-in for a manager, really good quality check-in conversation, what would I need to do to prep for that? Well, okay, I need to dig out my notes from the last meeting. Might be probably written down in a book. I've got to flick my way, find those notes. I probably need, until it's habit, I need to remember the guidance that HR told me of the things I should talk about. I've got to dig out the presentation slides that I went to, or maybe there's a one-pager on the intranet somewhere. We're going to want to talk about goals or objectives in this meeting, but I've got to find those. If I'm on a spreadsheet system, they've probably been emailed to me, but did I get the latest version? I've been told by HR that talking about feedback is a really good idea. I've got some stuff on email that people said that they did well. Let me try and search my emails for that feedback. And then I've got to print it out and take it into the meeting. So as you can see, that's already feeling very heavy in terms of time, brain cycles, and level of disruption to me, that in reality, only the most committed of managers are going to do that. And that's why we see that people, where they don't adopt the tech with it, they get a certain level of adoption, but those are the managers that are really committed. But we don't want just the committed managers to do this. We want all managers to engage in these conversations. So let's see that same process again, but using technology. So this is my check-in screen. If I want to have a check-in, I can schedule it in advance, or I can just sit down with my employee, click one button, and I've got a check-in meeting ready to go. I don't have to use any brain cycles to think about what to talk about because I've already got suggested coaching prompts here that's going to help me have a really good conversation. I can see my notes from the previous check-in meeting. So again, I'm not having to look those up. They're already there, and I can carry the conversation off from where we left off last time. we're going to want to talk about goals, so I want to have that information readily available to me from inside the check-in. So I've got that. I want to talk about feedback. It's all there. All the feedback that's been collected, I've just got it available to me. So as you can see, we're minimizing disruption, reducing the amount of brain cycles required to have a really good conversation. And at the end of the conversation, capture the action points and notes, job done. Minimal effort involved. Now, I think what's important to note about this, and where I think a lot of performance management software has gone wrong in the past, they've built a form for everything. And we don't want to fill out forms, we want to have a conversation. So what this does is mimicking a real conversation. Agenda points to talk about, actions and notes, no form filling. Another example of this is when we think about feedback. So I mentioned before, if we want feedback to be given more frequently, we can use technology to leverage that. But if it's not really simple and quick to do, according to Fogg's 3 principles, it's not going to happen. So let's see how this stacks up. So this is what it looks like when we're on a mobile phone on ClearReview. In terms of time, well, I can click a button. I've got hardly anything to fill in, and that's really important. Less is more in this new world of performance management. In terms of brain cycles, sometimes it can be hard to give feedback because I don't really know how to frame it. But if it's framed as either something they've done well or something they can improve or learn from, suddenly it becomes that little bit easier with a little tip there. And in terms of disruption, I've just walked out of a meeting, someone facilitated it brilliantly, I want to give them feedback, I don't have to then go back to my desk. What about if I can just do it from my phone there and then? It's in the flow of work and what people are thinking of at the time, so it's minimizing disruption. Now, we often, when we talk about feedback, there's a concern that giving feedback in this way will actually detract from a conversation, and we want people to have great conversations. But in reality, what we found is that giving feedback electronically actually leads to better quality conversations as per this manager. This is a quote from one of the managers that we spoke to. Because as you remember from the check-in, if all that feedback is there, we can reflect on that in the check-in and we can have a much richer conversation as opposed to a kind of one-to-one where I heard this happen, you've got the real feedback there. And an interesting concept that we didn't think about when we actually built this is that people have told us consistently that when they get feedback in writing, particularly positive feedback, it means even more to them than if it's given to them verbally. And I think a good example of this, analogy of this, is imagine that you had someone round for dinner and a couple of days later you got a card in the post saying thank you. Because they took the effort to write it down, it meant more to you than just someone saying thanks next time they see you. Okay, great in theory, but how does it actually work in practice? Well, what we did is, we've been doing this for quite a long time now. We've got a huge amount of data, and we started to analyze that data to see what we can learn. And what we found, over looking at data from 50,000 of our users over a 3-month period, we found that when people start having conversations in ClearReview, it leads to a feedback mindset behavior. What does that mean? It means they're 33% more likely to go and give or request feedback after that conversation. And then what happens is really interesting. Once they've received that feedback or given feedback, the next time they have a check-in conversation, they're 50% more likely to have a better quality conversation, so more specific agreed action points that are going to drive performance forward. I mentioned before that there's a lot of fear around this. Making a change to performance management can feel very hard. So I just want to share a success story to show that actually it is really possible. Now, this is from Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank, and I picked this one because they're quite a traditional organization. Performance management was very poorly regarded in the organization. Adoption levels were low. The only way they could get people to do an appraisal was say you can't get your pay rise or bonus unless you do it. So not great situation. They rolled out ClearReview, and they did some fantastic experiential training alongside of this, and I think this is a really good point. I'm not promising that tech solves everything, but in combination with some great developmental training, it can be incredibly powerful. So within 6 months of going live, every one of their employees had some meaningful goals set. Nearly all of them were having check-ins more regularly, and 78,000 bits of feedback were given just in the first 6 months. And that's continued. So we're a couple of years in now, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of bits of feedback, and almost everyone is still doing it. So it is possible. We asked them and said, what were the keys do you think were making that success? And obviously they said, the training combined with the technology really worked. But a word that kept coming up over and over again in the conversations we had with their users was this: simplicity. Now, I used to be a performance management consultant, as I said before, so I used to get paid to make things complicated. And it didn't work. What looks fantastic in theory If it's not simple enough to use and not quick enough to use, people won't do it. If you don't get adoption, it's all meaningless. Now, as someone who did know about simplicity, I think we've all got our views on Steve Jobs as a people manager, but in terms of products, he knew what he was talking about. As Steve said, it's really easy to make stuff hard. It's actually really hard to make things simple. We've spent more time in the last 3 years thinking about how we simplify things and what we leave out than what we've thought thinking about what we're going to put in. But if you do get simplicity right, as Steve said, you can move mountains. Now, if moving mountains feels like a long way from where you are with your performance management right now, I'd like to temper that with this final quote from you from the Chartered Institute of Marketing, who's one of our customers. As I said before, changing performance management can feel like a big task. It can feel like something that's going to be very scary to do. But as Sarah said, if we think of it as an ever-evolving project, and we're just brave and we make a start on that journey, then we will start to get somewhere. We don't have to have everything perfect from day one, but if we're just brave and make a tangible start, then we'll eventually get there. So that's the end of what I wanted to talk through. I haven't really touched the surface. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. So we've written ebooks on this subject. We've got videos. They're on our website. If you come and see our stand, which as I said is right behind me, we can take your details and send you some of the ebooks. If the software looked interesting to you, me and my colleagues would be happy to show you that. If you've got any particular questions that you want to talk about, I can take 2 or 3 now because we've got a few minutes, and then we'll be behind there for the rest of the day, and you can come and ask us with your questions. So does anyone have any questions? I've got one at the front here.
Did you get any feedback around how people were giving feedback? We're all taught feedback should be from the eye. I should own that feedback. Did you have any issues with the feedback coming back as being challenging?
Okay, so the question was, have we had any issues with feedback coming back being challenging and not being owned? So there's a couple of things to say around that. We deliberately made the feedback transparent in this. So if I'm giving feedback to you, you know it's me giving you feedback. And we did that because one of the problems with traditional 360 feedback is often the messages are not being internalized because I'm spending too long thinking, well, who said that? I think I know who said that. So we wanted to take that away. So transparency is key to that. Providing that framework of something you've done well, something you could do better next time. There's no option for something you've done really badly. So it's framing things in that positive way. So we haven't seen that issue, particularly around feedback being given in a kind of nasty way. We do have a retract feature. So if there is an issue, it can be retracted as a kind of safety belt. It's something that people always worry about. They said, I'm scared because it's going to open up a can of worms. My view is they can send emails now and give negative feedback if they want to. This won't start getting people doing that. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, we've got one. We've got the roving microphone there. Did we have one? No? Okay, well, thank you so much for listening. As I said, me and my colleagues will be just behind this wall here, and I look forward to speaking to you. Thank you.